You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome our first guest today on the program, our good friend Phil Kerpen, who's the president of American Commitment. And we love the work that they do at American Commitment, but it seems that every major and important issue like this that comes up, they're always at the forefront in setting up something to do their very best to combat it and educate Americans on what they could do to coalesce together and try to stop, in this case, really an out-of-control government. Phil, welcome to the program with Brett and John on the Final Say. And what we're talking about is your launching of www.theirspowergrab.com, and I love it. Phil, please tell us about this.
There's no the, so it's just irspowergrab.com. So we're not sending it to people that something doesn't exist.
Oh, sorry.
Look, basically, this is what's happened. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of the IRS targeting scandal. Hundreds of Tea Party, conservative, pro-life groups had their IRS status held up for years. The IRS confessed to illegitimate, improper targeting of conservatives. Lois Lerner said, "Oh, so sorry, I did that." The president came out and said, "You have a right to be angry, and I'm angry. We're going to get to the bottom of this." And 8 months later, the president says, "Not a smidgen of corruption, nothing went wrong." So we still got a lot to learn about the original scandal, but at the same time that we're still trying to figure out what went on, the IRS had the nerve to issue a new rule, a new proposed regulation for nonprofit groups, including all those Tea Party groups and other 501c4 organizations, that would essentially cripple their ability to involve themselves in public policy issues and in political campaigns and sort of be engaged in any way in public policy. And these rules, when you look at them, they really look like they were sort of reverse engineered to ensnare all of the exact same groups that have been targeted by the targeting of conservative group scandal, but appear facially neutral. So a lot of liberal groups are angry about this also. We got the ACLU, the Sierra Club, the NAACP, all telling the IRS, don't do this. This is going to cripple us. But you've got all these Democratic politicians that are essentially saying, look, if we can shut up these big groups like AFP and the Tea Party groups, we're willing to stick it to our own guys also, anything it takes to get through this election. And so that's kind of the state of play. There was just a public comment period. The IRS received over 140,000 comments telling them not to do this. I think they're back on their heels as a consequence of that. They have promised to do a public hearing before moving forward. We did have a vote in the House to stop these rules, got every Republican and 14 Democrats. I'm not optimistic we can get a Senate vote, of course, because Harry Reid doesn't let them vote on anything over there. But we certainly have made a splash, and if they do intend to do this, we're going to make it awfully tough for them. And I can also say that several groups are certainly going to litigate if they do try to move forward with this rule. But that's where we are right now.
I'm glad you just said that because, I'm very familiar with regulations because I've been practicing accounting for, 13 or 14 years now. And first of all, the IRS code is absolutely ridiculous and out of control to begin with. But the regulations are, they get so into the weeds, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what they do. And I want to read something that you provided in your comments here. And these regs are they're proposing to restrict groups from engaging in voter registration drives, candidate debates, voter guides, voter records, and key votes. And I have to ask you, how do any organizations that fall under 501c4 not participate in any of these activities? This is absolutely an offense and attack on free speech.
Yeah, it is. Look, the one of the key things that they haven't told us yet in the proposed rule is how much of these activities an organization is allowed to have. So they set out all these things that they said basically these are bad activities, they're going to be limited, and then they said what percentage of these things ought to be allowed. So we don't know if they're going to say 0 and you can't do any of that stuff at all, or they're going to say it can be 40% of your activities or 20% or whatever other number it is. But along with that, think of all the record-keeping that goes with that, all of the potential exposure to the IRS auditing you and everything else. And at the end of the day, if you're a group, one of the things you didn't even mention there is they include it as political if you weigh in on a judicial nomination. They say a judicial nominee is a candidate under this rule, even though they're never running for an election. So let's say that one of the Supreme Court justices, for whatever reason, is no longer on the bench tomorrow, either resigns or passes or what have you. President Obama names someone. That would obviously be the dominant fight of the year. Most C4s, liberal and conservative, would spend most of their time on that Supreme Court fight. But every single penny and every single minute of time, and they also want you to track volunteer time under this rule, which is another crazy burden, but every single moment of every bit of resource and money and time that you put into that Supreme Court fight, that would count as political under this rule. So, you'd run into whatever the cap they set, you'd run into it right away. And so this is a really ridiculous rule. All of the definitions are too broad, and more to the point, there's no basis for the IRS restricting political activities of nonprofits anywhere in the code. They're basically making this up because they wish they could pass a law to do this through Congress. They can't. Republicans won't let them. They wish they could do it at the Federal Election Commission. They can't because it was deliberately set up to be a bipartisan commission, so one party could not pass abusive rules and regulations. So what are they doing? They're going to the IRS and saying, hey, can you just codify what you were doing to conservatives before, what you got caught doing before? Can you find a way to write a rule that on its face will appear neutral, but will still manage to shut up all the same groups that we don't want to deal with? And I think that's how this came about.
Yeah, this is incredibly frustrating, and I always wonder what. I understand that we've created the IRS and the tax code through the amendment process, but it seems to me that the IRS is often beyond the bounds of the powers that certainly we should be allowing them to have, but in my mind, what they should constitutionally be afforded, and this is one of those cases. I think this is very dangerous, which is why you pointed out that even the ACLU and other groups, are along with you guys and being upset by what's going on here.
Yeah, it takes a really, really bad idea to get me on the same side as the ACLU and the NAACP and the Sierra Club. Like, that doesn't happen too often. So when you've got me and AFP and FreedomWorks and Heritage, and we're all saying the exact same thing that ACLU and Sierra Club and NAACP and Alliance for Justice and so on are saying, then you really have a situation where entrenched politicians just want to silence the grassroots of both parties. They just want, normal, regular people who involve themselves in public policy issues through these groups. They want to be shut out because it's easier for them to get reelected that way. And I think, they should be very careful. If this administration is so intent on finding a way to shut all of us up, I don't think that's going to actually help their friends in the Senate as much as they think it is. I think people are going to resent it, and they're going to fight back even harder.
Phil, John here. Very interesting that you point that out. I have felt for a long time that this president is turning otherwise, let's just say, agency overlords. I mean, people long before this president came in got queasy when they heard the word IRS, but it feels like we're actually turning these organizations into government arms of basically to stifle the people. It's almost like what the East Germans had with the Stasis, for example. And you wonder when the IRS becomes a weapon to be used against the people, against due process. Basically, they're weapons of political warfare. And so you wonder to yourself, where is the end game? And I think that's the point you were making, is that people even from the far left, are starting to realize, well, if it could be used against the right, when the right's in power, which at some point they will be, they could use it against the left. So the question I have for you, Phil, is when you look back in history, is this a relatively new phenomenon, taking this to this extreme? And this, of course, transcends just the IRS, or is Obama following lessons learned from some other presidents who way overstepped their bounds?
Well, look, I think the powers of the presidency were dramatically curtailed following Watergate, and the president lost a lot of power in the budget process with the Budget Act of '74. The president was, no longer has impoundment powers. The president was just restricted across the board. And I think ever since then, every single president since then has tried to expand presidential power more and more to get it back to the point that it was and even beyond it. And I think that under George W. Bush, we kind of surpassed the level of presidential power that we had pre-Watergate. I think that was sort of where we got back to where we were. That sort of restored the strong presidency to where it had been. And I think that under Obama, he's taken it even further. And I think we now have a presidency that's stronger than we've ever seen before in terms of the open willingness to disregard laws when they're inconvenient and to go around Congress. And not just go around Congress, but to brag about it as if it's a virtue. And I think that that's making a lot of people very, very uneasy. We've got a liberal professor, Jonathan Turley, saying that the way that Obama's behaving is unconstitutional, and the idea of going around Congress raises profound constitutional issues. And there was a Fox poll 3 or 4 weeks ago. They asked, is this the way our system of government is supposed to work, with the president going around the Congress when they say no to him? And 74% of people said no. And so I think this president, I'll give you another example. Bush took recess appointments to a length that we'd never seen before. He recess appointed a judge to the 11th Circuit when I think Congress sat for 10 days, so it was the shortest recess in history that President tried to say counted for the recess appointments clause. Well, Obama, Democrats went nuts, by the way, when he did that. Ted Kennedy and Lawrence Tribe filed a brief saying it was unconstitutional and so forth. Well, President Obama, he decided, I'm going to declare the Senate's in recess the day after they gavel into session, and they don't think they're in recess at all. And so I think in all these areas we're seeing things that had been happening, kind of the trend really since the presidency was curtailed post-Watergate. The trend has been towards more and more presidential power, but I think we've reached a new level now, really getting uneasy with it. And even the Washington Post, when this president announced the second one-year delay in the employer mandate under Obamacare, the Washington Post editorialized against it, unsigned editorial. They have a lot of conservative op-ed writers, but the unsigned editorials are usually very liberal. But they had an unsigned editorial saying that he couldn't do that and it was wrong for him to do that. And the reasoning they used was exactly what you pointed out. They said, look, if Rand Paul is president and he suspends all of Obamacare, we're going to complain about that. So we can't not complain when Obama is part of it. And I think that increasingly people across the political spectrum are concerned about the idea that our presidential elections are going to be kind of, for all the marbles, and that our checks and balances and separation of powers is going to become effectively meaningless. And, if you're someone on the left and you remember the Bush years and everything you complained about and so forth, that's a pretty scary prospect.
Well, perhaps even the relatively uninformed voters are seeing where we've gone from stealing political bubblegum from the five and dime store to political armed robbery. Phil, when you look at the IRS powergrab.com effort you have underway, are you finding and are you targeting help from the states? Because it seems to me that the governors are also one of the biggest losers in this federal power grab ongoing. And along with that, are there any particular folks on the conservative side of the aisle who are standing as a barrier that fans of the final say could maybe write letters to, pick the phone and call and try to help your efforts move forward?
Well, IRSpowergrab.com had been sending comments into the IRS docket, which closed last week, and so I switched it over. Now it sends letters into the U.S. Senate demanding a vote on the House-passed bill to stop this IRS rule, which we're unlikely to get that vote, as I said, but I think putting in the demands for it and then putting some of these Democratic senators on the spot and saying, why can't you get this vote scheduled? Why won't you stand up to Harry Reid and the president and stand up for free speech, I think is very important. Pretty much every Republican's been good on this. I don't think of any Republicans who've been problematic on this, and that's actually really encouraging because when these rules first came out, I was worried that a lot of establishment-type Republicans would think silencing the Tea Party and other grassroots conservatives might be a good thing for them, and I really haven't seen any of that, at least not publicly. So that unanimous vote among Republicans in the House last week, I think, was very, very encouraging, and we're just going to try to put more heat on the Senate. This broader theme we were just talking about, the reason the presidents have been able to get away with all the things he's been doing is we've got Senate Democrats, and they control the Senate, so we've got a Senate that is largely acting as an appendage of the executive branch. It's not taking its constitutional duty seriously at all. And, that's, I think, what we can do something about this year when we engage, people we know in states that have got competitive Senate races. And, I hope New Jersey gets competitive, but we'll see, who the candidate ends up being and so forth. But in these states that have competitive Senate races, we really got to put pressure on some of these guys and say, look, do you think the president should be deploying all these agencies to do whatever he wants? And, if you think that's okay, why the heck do you want to be a senator? Because that job doesn't do anything when it functions the way Harry Reid's been having the Senate operate. And so I think in terms of, this being a midterm year and so forth, I think that's where we need to really focus the next few months to get pressure on the Senate Democrats that are allowing this to happen. And I'll let you guys know if I see a Republican who's not with us, but so far everyone's been pretty good, at least publicly.
Well, that sounds good. And again, Phil Kerpen with American Commitment, the president of. I want to thank you for taking us on, and I'll give you an opportunity again to provide the website and also where they can go to find out more about American Commitment.
IRSPowergrab.com is the website for what we've been talking about. The main site for American Commitment is AmericanCommitment.org.
Great, and we'll post that up as well, and we thank you as always, Phil. It's always great to speak with you, and hopefully we'll see you down at CPAC this week.
All right, have a good one.
All right, take it easy.